everybody, welcome back to the video series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video we're going to finish up our first lesson, which was intended to just give you an overall overview or introduction of what the discipline of philosophy is all about. And you'll recall that I said in order to do that, there were three questions that we would need to take a look at. And so let's recall to ourselves what those three questions are. So first, the nature of philosophy, the definition of philosophy, or what is a philosophical question? And we looked at this briefly. We gave some examples of questions that philosophers looked at and thought a little bit about what might unite these questions. Second, we took a close look at the method of philosophy, specifically the method of argument and the nature of logic. We went over how it is that philosophers reason, how we outline arguments, how we represent philosophical reasoning, in a way that allows us to evaluate whether an argument is good or bad. And in this video, I now want to take a look at the value of philosophy. Right, so as I mentioned earlier, a lot of philosophical questions are difficult, they're abstract, they take a lot of careful thought, and so there is a fair amount of labor that goes into really thinking seriously about philosophical questions. So what is the benefit? What is the value of doing so? Why should I bother studying philosophy in the first place? In order to think about that, what we're going to examine in this video is a short piece of writing by a philosopher named Bertrand Russell, who was a British philosopher writing mostly in the 20th century. And this particular piece of writing, it's a chapter from his book entitled The Problems of Philosophy. And this particular chapter is the final chapter in that book, in which he essentially goes through some of the major classic problems of philosophy, gives his take on them. And he said, and to begin this chapter, he says, well, now that we've done this brief review of some classic philosophical questions, we now come to the question of what is the value of philosophy and why should it be studied? And interestingly, you might expect that at this point, Russell would launch into a long and eloquent speech defending why philosophy is important and why everyone should care about it. But in fact, he starts from a different direction. He first says, well, let's think about some of the reasons why someone might think philosophy is not worthwhile. And in this opening paragraph, he actually identifies two different reasons, two different accusations that one might make against the claim that philosophy is valuable. So he says, it is the more necessary to consider this question of the value of philosophy in view of the fact that many men, under the influence of science or practical affairs, are inclined to doubt whether philosophy is anything better than innocent but useless trifling, hair-splitting distinctions, and controversies on matters concerning which knowledge is impossible. So I've highlighted the text for you, these two different accusations. First, there's the accusation that Russell considers that philosophy is innocent, but it's just useless trifling. What does that mean? Well, he might say, well, thinking about philosophical questions is harmless, it's fine, but at the end of the day, it's not very useful, it's not very significant, it's just more of a trivial activity. That's the first accusation. The second one he considers here is that philosophical knowledge is impossible. One might say, well, even if it's true that philosophical questions are important, they're worth thinking about, it doesn't really matter because how are we ever going to discover the answer? Many great minds have been thinking for 2,000 years on questions of, does God exist? Do we have free will? What's the meaning of life? Where does morality come from? Many great minds have spent a lot of time thinking about these questions, and to this day, many philosophers still disagree. So we might wonder, is it really possible to arrive at a consensus? Is it possible to arrive confidently at an answer to these questions? Can we actually attain knowledge in philosophy? So Russell outlines these two different reasons to be skeptical that there really is any value in philosophy, and he seeks to respond to both. Okay, so how does he do this? Well, before we look at that, we should probably take a little more time to think a little more detail about each of these accusations. So one of the things he says about the first accusation, he says that those who are taken by this idea that philosophy as useless, as innocent but useless trifling, are usually under the influence of the hard sciences, or they're very concerned with their own practical affairs. So why is this? And let's take the second one. Why would someone who's very concerned with the practical affairs of everyday life think philosophy is nice but not all that useful? Okay, well, if you think about it this way, as we said before, philosophers consider very abstract questions. Does God exist? What is the meaning of life? And at the same time, most of the time in your day-to-day life, when you're going about trying to, go to work to make money, go to the store to get food, go to school to earn a degree, you're thinking about the practical needs that you have, the practical affairs, the practical things you need to take care of. Those questions don't come to mind. So if you're someone who's struggling, for instance, just to get the money you need to feed your family, if you have a long checklist of things you need to do at work, or else your boss is going to be extremely angry with you, you might say, that's nice that there's people out there taking the time to twiddle their thumbs and think about whether God exists, but I've got much more pressing matters at hand. So, the first thing Russell wants to say is that those who see philosophy as a sort of harmless but useless trifling are often, perhaps he thinks, too entirely focused on just the practical needs of our lives. And not to say, of course, practical needs are important. We need to make money, we need to have food, we need to have shelter, we need to do all those things. But he sees it as a sort of overly influential perspective, which doesn't allow us to see the value of considering more abstract or general ideas. So that's what lies behind the first accusation. And then how about the second accusation? Why would someone think that knowledge of philosophy is impossible? And we'll get to this later, I actually think this charge is, as it stands, really essentially baseless. I don't think there's any reason to think that knowledge of philosophy is impossible, strictly speaking. But as I mentioned before, there's no doubt that attaining knowledge in philosophy is difficult. And there's no doubt that there is a wide array of disagreement. So one could see how one would be led to make that accusation. Okay, so those are the two accusations he's going to consider. Now we have to see, how is he going to respond to this? How is he going to say that despite these accusations, the study of philosophy is in fact valuable? Well, first we have to think about the question, what makes any academic discipline valuable? Where does the value come from studying any academic discipline? Physics, chemistry, psychology, political science, right? Where does it come from? And on this point, he draws a comparison between philosophy and the hard physical sciences. So he says, physical science, through the medium of inventions, is useful to innumerable people who are wholly ignorant of it. Thus, the study of physical science is to be recommended not only or primarily because of the effect on the student, but rather because of the effect on mankind in general. I think it's interesting that no one really questions or thinks to try to be skeptical about whether sciences like physics or chemistry or computer science are valuable. And in part, the reason for that is we see the fruits of their labor. We see the numerous inventions that these sciences have brought about. Have they made our lives easier, more efficient? If you think about the advances in medical science and how that has improved the well-being of the human species, it's absolutely staggering to think about. So no one's going to question the value of those disciplines because we see how valuable they are all the time, even to people who are entirely ignorant of those disciplines. So even if you're someone who knows nothing about chemistry, nothing about physics, nothing about medical science, right, if you haven't been educated in that way, you still benefit from the inventions and the advances made by these sciences. And for that reason, while Russell would certainly allow that some of the value of studying the hard sciences, some of the value is for the person, him or herself, who is studying it, the primary value lies upon is for society as a whole. So what we say is that the hard sciences, Russell's saying they have primarily a utilitarian value. The primary reason why they're a good thing is because of how much better they make our lives. Okay. But he says there's also another sort of value that a study could have, that an academic discipline could have, beyond the utilitarian value, which means utility or usefulness. So beyond the usefulness, there's a personal value. And he thinks this is the main value that philosophy has. So here's what he says. He says, thus utility does not belong to philosophy. Now what does that mean? I mean, to be blunt, to put it very straightforwardly, in a sense he's saying there's a real sense in which philosophy is useless. Which sounds like an awkward thing for a philosopher to say. But I'll have more to say about that in a second. And he continues, he says, if the study of philosophy has any value at all for others, then students of philosophy must be only indirectly, through its effects upon the lives of those who study it. So whereas the hard sciences, their main value is utilitarian, their main value is what benefits do they bring to society? For philosophy, the main value is for the person who is studying it. The philosopher, him or herself, they are the primary individuals who benefit from the study of philosophy. This doesn't mean that studying philosophy doesn't have benefits for society as a whole. I like to think that having a society with more reflective, more rational people is a good thing. But primarily, he says, the value of philosophy is for the person who studies. It has a personal value. So first, you can see how he's setting this up. He's certainly not saying anything bad about the hard sciences. He's not saying anything bad about philosophy. He's simply saying they have different types of value. And if we accept that philosophy has primarily a personal value, then the next question should be, well, what is that personal value? What am I going to get from studying this discipline? Okay. Now, to understand this, we need to think a little bit more about the practical individual I was talking about earlier. And specifically, we need to think of what would be missing if we lived our lives in an entirely practical way. And what I mean by that is just focusing on our survival needs, our needs for, our immediate needs for friendship or to get a job, or to just take care of the practical affairs of everyday life. So here's what Russell says. The practical man, as this word is often used, is one who recognizes only material needs, who realizes that men must have food for the body, but is oblivious of the necessity of providing food for the mind. So for instance, if your main focus is, okay, well, I need to get an education so I can get a job, so I can earn money, so I can have a nice house, a nice car, so I can have the kind of food I want to eat, so I can go out to eat. If you're just focused on your material wants and needs, then you're the practical person that Russell is describing. And if you are that sort of person and you're successful in your endeavor, then you've provided all the food for the body you could ever need. All your needs and wants and desires in a sort of bodily sense are met. But he says you haven't provided food for the mind. And his claim is that there is something that even if we had every single practical need met for us, you would still be lacking if you had never developed your mind in the way you think philosophy does. So here's what Russell says. If all men were well off, if poverty and disease had been reduced to their lowest possible point, so we imagine there's no people who are impoverished, no people who are going hungry, there would still remain much to be done to produce a valuable society. And even in the existing world, the goods of the mind are at least as important as the goods of the body. And it is exclusively among the goods of the mind that the value of philosophy is to be found, and only those who are not indifferent to these goods can be persuaded that the study of philosophy is not a waste of time. So what is the personal value of philosophy? It has something to do with the development of your mind. It has something to do beyond just meeting the mere practical needs that characterize the human condition. Even if you had all the money you could ever want, even if you had all the pleasurable experiences you could ever want, if you never took the time to reflect upon deep philosophical questions and develop your mind, there would be something missing and lacking from your life. And if that's the case, we can now understand a little better why Russell seems to imply that there's a sense in which philosophy is useless. Now, clearly he doesn't think philosophy is worthless. In fact, Russell thinks philosophy is very worthwhile. In fact, he thinks you cannot live a full human life without feeding your mind in the way philosophy does. So it's worthwhile, but it's not useful in the straightforwardly practical sense. You don't need to study philosophy to get a job. You don't need to study philosophy to put food on the table, etc., etc. And in fact, we might go a step further and we might say, it's precisely because philosophy its value isn't primarily practical that it's one of the highest goods. So think about, for instance, let's say there's a certain job you want. There's a certain career path you're pursuing. And let's say the reason you're doing it is because you think it'll make you a lot of money. So you go to school, you get the proper education, you say, I'm going to pursue this career path. So let's say you're in the middle of your education, you're in the middle of pursuing this career path, and then bam, you find out you get a huge inheritance. Or you win the lottery. For however it happens, you get a ton of money coming your way. Now, if the only reason you were pursuing that career path was for the sake of money, then the minute that happens is the minute that career path is meaningless to you. It no longer makes any difference. And that just is the case with all practically, strictly useful things. If you're hungry, then a turkey sandwich is very valuable to you. If you're full, it's not valuable at all. If there's somewhere you need to go, then your car is very useful. If you live in a city with great public transportation, that car doesn't mean anything at all. All strictly practically useful things are only valuable insofar as you need the end they're producing. But if you don't need it, you don't need them anymore. But philosophy is not like that. It's not useful for any specifically practical purpose other than expanding and developing and growing your mind. And that's one good that I think Russell sees. If you are living a human life, you can't simply just get rid of. If you take seriously what it means to live a good human life, then you can't just say, development of my mind using my higher reflective faculties isn't important. To do that would be to live something less than a human life, to live the life of an animal. So in Russell's view, I don't think it's unfair to say that he would see philosophy as among the highest goods precisely because it's not valued primarily for its practical usefulness. Okay. So this is how we respond to the first accusation. Is philosophy useless in a sense? Sure, it's not going to help you directly get a job or get something to eat if you're hungry, but it helps you pursue some of the highest and most important human goods. What about the second accusation? That philosophical knowledge is impossible. Now, Russell has a discussion here. You say, why would someone say that? He has a discussion here of the fact that if a philosopher is honest, he or she should admit that, and here's put it in his words, it cannot be maintained that philosophy has had any very great measure of success in its attempts to provide definite answers to its questions. If you ask professional philosophers, does God exist? You'll get a wide variety of different answers and levels of confidence. If you ask, do human beings have free will? Same thing. What determines our personal identity? Same thing. What is the correct moral theory? Same thing. On any philosophical question you can ask, you're going to encounter wide disagreement. And as I said earlier, that might give the impression that philosophical knowledge is impossible. And of course, if philosophical knowledge is impossible, then, why are we bothering? Now, in order to evaluate this specific accusation, we need to get a little more clear on exactly what it means. Here are two possibilities for what this idea that philosophical knowledge is impossible could mean. First possibility, we'll call this accusation 2A. Philosophical knowledge is impossible because there are no answers to philosophical questions. Now, what would this mean? This would mean that when you ask a philosophical question, is there free will? Does God exist? Where does morality come from? You might as well just ask, what's your favorite ice cream flavor? Because when you ask, or what's the best ice cream flavor, right? Because when you ask, what is the best ice cream flavor? We don't think there's some like real truth to that. I mean, you might like strawberry, and I might like chocolate, and we can both admit, yeah, we have different preferences, but there's no real truth about this. There's nothing really to argue about. So if what we mean when we say philosophical knowledge is impossible is that there are no answers to philosophical questions, that just means there's nothing to argue about. There's nothing to discuss. If that's true, we should end this class immediately and all go home. And as much as you might want to do that, hopefully not, but if that is what you want to do, I'm sorry to say that I don't think that's very convincing. And let's just take one example of a philosophical question. Does God exist? Okay, so you may not be very confident that you know what the answer to that question is, or you might. But no matter what you think about that question, it doesn't make any sense to say that there is no answer. If we define what we mean by God to be one certain thing, and usually philosophers define God in this way as a omniscient, which means an all-knowing, an all-powerful, an all-good being who's the origin or creator of the universe in some sense. So if we define God that way, there either is a thing like that out in the world, or there isn't. You might say, I don't know what the answer to that question is, and that's perfectly fine, but there is some answer. Either that thing exists, or it doesn't exist. Or something like it exists, but that thing itself, in the way I described it, doesn't exist. There has to be some answer to that question. When you say God exists, or you say God doesn't exist, you are making a claim about the world. And that claim can be true or false. So there is an answer to that question. There is an answer to the question of does God exist? But maybe when people say it's impossible to have knowledge of that question, maybe they don't mean there's no answer. Maybe they mean something else. So let's consider possibility 2b. Maybe the accusation is philosophical knowledge is impossible because the questions are too abstract, too difficult, too complex for the human mind to adequately understand. Maybe the claim isn't, you might say, look, yes, there's an answer to whether God exists, but none of us are really going to be able to figure that out. I mean, that's just way too abstract for the human mind. Our minds weren't meant to be able to comprehend and think about what caused the origin of the universe. Okay, fair enough. I think this is an accusation that's worth taking more seriously. And what's interesting about this is that to a certain extent, Russell agrees with this. So here's what he says. There are many questions, and among them, those that are of the profoundest interest to our spiritual life, which so far as we can see, must remain insoluble to the human intellect unless its powers become of quite different order from what they are now. So he's saying there are certain questions the human mind can ask that we should also recognize we're probably not ever going to really be confident we can achieve the answer to them. And what are these questions? They're just the sort of questions that a philosopher would ask. He gives examples. Does the universe have any plan or purpose? Or is it just random atoms? Is consciousness part of the universe? Or is it just a transitory accident on a small planet on which life must ultimately become impossible? Are good and evil of importance to the universe or only to us human beings? Such questions are asked by philosophy and variously answered by philosophers, but it would seem that whether answers be otherwise discoverable or not, the answers suggested by philosophy are none of them demonstrably true. And what does that mean? Of all the different answers that have been suggested to does God exist? Do human beings have free will? What determines our personal identity? Where does morality come from? Many philosophers give many different answers to those questions, but he says realistically we can't stand here and say that we know which one is true with complete confidence. And you might say, well, if that's the case, then what are we doing here? If we know from the outset that we're unlikely to arrive at a final answer to the questions that philosophers care about, then why bother asking the questions in the first place? And here's where Russell takes a more optimistic note. He says, however slight may be the hope of discovering an answer, it is part of the business of philosophy to continue to consider such questions. Now, this might seem rather odd, because what Russell is saying here is that no matter how long you think about these fundamental philosophical questions, it's very likely you're going to become more uncertain about them. Right? And I can attest to this from my own experience. I've studied philosophy for a long time, for many years at this point, and I can legitimately say that in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, the more I've thought about a philosophical question, the more I've read about it, the more different views I've considered, the less certain I've become about what the truth is. And even if I think I arrive at an answer to a philosophical question, that usually doesn't get rid of my uncertainty. It usually suggests further questions to my mind. And so there's always something else I'm unsure about. Now, one of the things I think you should really take away from what Russell's saying is here, what should we think about the fact that philosophy leads to uncertainty? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And we might consider the alternative. Think about what are some of the ways that throughout human history, human beings, what are some of the methods we have used to get rid of uncertainty about these questions? We'll just stick with the question of does God exist? Okay, well, clearly one of the main ways that we've gotten rid of uncertainty is religion, religious communities, religious traditions, which give an answer to this question. And they give an answer to a whole host of other philosophical questions as well, ranging from the relationship between the mind and the body, personal identity, free will, morality. Systems of thought that are embedded in traditions and communities and societies have long been used by human beings to get rid of our uncertainty. You're born into a certain community, a certain religion, a certain culture, and that culture, that community comes with pre-made answers, common sense answers to very deep philosophical questions. If you're born into a culture, in many of that sort, in many cases you sort of get a pre-made worldview. They say this is the common sense worldview. And the advantage of that is you don't have to think about it. You don't have to grapple with uncertainty. You don't have to go through the hard work of thinking about different answers. The answer is given to you. So that's the alternative. And there are some advantages to that, because uncertainty, well, it's not always the most fun thing. But what's interesting is Russell says that in fact the very value of philosophy lies in uncertainty. So he says the value of philosophy is in fact to be sought largely in its very uncertainty. The man who has no tincture of philosophy goes through life imprisoned in the prejudices derived from common sense, from the habitual beliefs of his age or his nation, and from convictions which have grown up in his mind without the cooperation of consent or his deliberate reason. So he says, if the way you've arrived at all your beliefs is just by accepting the common cultural story, the common religious story, the common sense beliefs given to you by your parents, whether they be about moral subjects, political subjects, accepting the beliefs of the political party that your family has always followed. If you simply accept whatever beliefs you are given from your social and communal context, then you never have to think. You never have to grapple with doubt. And the way that Russell describes this is the tyranny of custom. You just accept uncritically the beliefs of your social group, political party, religion, family, or the common sense at your time and place. And what this gives you is certainty and conviction. On the other hand, you could reject the tyranny of custom. You could say the way I'm going to arrive at my beliefs is through philosophy, rational argumentation, considering all perspectives on a question, believing whatever I think the evidence best shows. And this undoubtedly is going to lead you to uncertainty and doubt. If there's anything, I guess if there's anything I'm really sure about philosophy, is it's going to breed less certainty. But what's interesting here, notice early he described the person without philosophy as going through life imprisoned. Imprisoned in the common sense prejudices given to them by their societal context. Now, what does that mean? Well, it seems to imply that there's something freeing about philosophy. So he says philosophy removes the somewhat arrogant dogmatism of those who have never traveled into the region of liberating doubt. So yes, doubt can be uncomfortable. Doubt can be irritating. Doubt can even be scary. Doubt can be hazardous. But can also be freeing. When you realize that you're the sort of being who can think carefully about life's most important questions, evaluate the evidence for yourself, and evaluate whether that goes against the common sense beliefs you've been given. It's a very scary prospect, it's less certain, it's less safe, but Russell also thinks it's very liberating. And the sort of human mind who would enslave itself to only the common beliefs of its own culture that it happens to be born in Russell's view, he thinks that individual really isn't living a proper human life at all. And this fundamentally is the reason why Russell thinks that philosophy has value for individuals, and that value is by developing and freeing our mind, allowing us to become critical reasoners. Okay, I will stop there. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you in the next video.